When it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and the situation there, do you feel that we're going to have again and again these sort of attacks on the part of the United States and Iranian responding?
I absolutely do. I think that that is the state of affairs going forward until there is a drastic change in circumstances for negotiations to proceed with different conditions on the table. We're going to continue to see escalation, up, down, up, down, up, down. And I surmise that that will likely happen on Fridays going into Mondays for manipulation of the stock market, as we saw this past weekend with the announcements of attacks on Friday, peace talks apparently being announced yesterday, and then now going back into how those talks are going to look today. You know, Monday's already almost done in the Middle East. We go into Tuesday. What happens from that? I can very much think that by Friday or Thursday night, we're back into Donald Trump and the administration saying, well, Iran is not willing to negotiate or talk. We're tired of it. We're going to hit targets again. This cycle that the United States has created, that the world, quite frankly, has allowed, is going to continue with this escalation, de-escalation, escalation, de-escalation. But what's critical to see is that in each escalation, the measures become greater in terms of the second and third order effects or the consequences of. In this last round of the escalation, the fallout that we see from that is not just necessarily in the Gulf itself, as in the Persian Gulf or Gulf nations, but in the region. You know, we now see Saudi Arabia arming and influencing the Saudi Hadramat tribal alliance now in Yemen. We now see that growing. We see incursions from Israel, not only in Lebanon, in the Hebron, Mount Hermon area, but now into Syria, past the areas of the Golan Heights into Abdin and Jamal, and further east. So in each of these things, we see these consequences, this fallout that escalates each time. So I'm deeply concerned about how that escalation then becomes wider and out of the grasp of what the United States thinks it can manage in terms of negotiations. But it's getting to be even more concerning and quite, for lack of better terms, quite worrisome. But yes, I think that what we're going to see throughout the period of this U.S.-Iran negotiations, or cold conflict to hot flashes of conflict, are this continuation of talks, escalation, talks, escalation, talks, escalation, to where on the United States side, the U.S. is not really being very genuine or transparent with these talks, because as you mentioned at the onset, the memorandum of understanding clearly dictates certain preconditions for other conditions. And again, the MOU is simply a framework to go forward. So in that conditions of these are what we agree to then go forward in this framework are the immediate and permanent stop of war on all fronts, to include Lebanon. And it's in there very clearly, right? That hasn't happened. Then the lifting of frozen assets. Well, apparently the U.S. is going back on that and saying, well, you're not going to get the assets frozen until this. Well, it's agreed upon in the MOU that those discussions on nuclear reduction or IAEA inspections or whatever that nuclear oversight would be wouldn't come until after, wouldn't come until later. And J.D. Vance even reaffirmed that in his comments after his first meeting in Switzerland, where he said, today was great progress, right? He said that. Today was great progress. And, some reporters specifically asked about the inspections, et cetera, that J.D. Vance had said that Iran had disavowed, that said, no, we didn't talk about that. And then J.D. Vance said, well, the discussions on inspections and the nuclear program and the de-enrichment or the dilution of enrichment, that will come later. But right now we're focusing on opening the Strait of Hormuz and meeting the initial demands, right? So when you look at that from where we were a week ago to where we are today, the fighting in Lebanon still is happening. Israel is still in Lebanon and has in fact incurred further into now occupied territory of the Golan Heights and into Syria. The United States has struck Iran once again. The United States has not released or unfrozen those frozen assets, which again, That's not money that the United States is giving to Iran. That's not a gift. That is Iran's money. That is Iran's assets. So when you consider the United States saying, oh, we're not going to unfreeze those or whatever the control measure is, the United States has quite literally gone back on or betrayed every aspect of this MOU thus far to where we stand today on the 29th of June, 2026.
Here is the paragraph number 5 in
Yes.
MOU. It says, upon the signing of this MOU, Iran will make arrangements using its best effort for the safe passage of commercial vessels with no charge for 60 days from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman and vice versa. Basically, it's all about Iran managing the strait and the region. Nothing of the United States has been mentioned in this paragraph. While you see the United States coming in and attacking Iran because of what's going on, and they have been trying. They tried to manipulate the situation there. It wasn't just the United States. United Kingdom was giving wrong routes to the tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. This is the problem there. And again, this is a violation of article or paragraph 5 of MOU.
Yeah, it's well. So when you look at the Strait of Hormuz, so that graph that you showed in the very beginning is very informative. It's enlightening. It elucidates the situation. Look at how many vessels, how much product was going through the Strait of Hormuz.
Tony, sorry for interrupting you. What has happened right after the signing of MOU? They thought that they can organize the Iranian side. This is my understanding of what has happened. They thought that they can organize, they can control the traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. Then they let each and every vessel to pass. Then you see go up. Above 50 vessels passing, and then they see that they're using, they're trying to somehow manipulate the strait to use the different routes, not those designated routes. That's why you see they're controlling again and dropping down, the passage of the vessels. This is my understanding of what has happened. Go ahead. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yes. So the idea that the strait is closed, let's consider it if I'm crossing the US Canadian border and I have to show my passport, the border isn't closed, but it is controlled by border basically the customs and border of Canada if I'm in the US and going into Canada. So the border isn't closed. I just have to show my passport. And let's say that I'm on a restricted list. I'm not allowed in Canada. And I pull up in line and I show them my passport. And they say, no, you can't come in. Well, the border's not closed. It's just restricted to me. So the administrative control over it being, in this case, in this analogy, the Canadian side, the border is open. There's restrictions. And yes, you have to wait in line to go through. Now, let's say that let's just say under normal conditions, that passage from the U.S. into Canada. Let's say if you've got one of the known traveler cards where you can just go right through, scan it, and blink right through it, because you live on the Canadian side and you work in the U.S. side, so to speak. So when you're talking about that, let's say that there's a heightened threat and that the Canadian border then shuts that process down to where you have to go back in line. Well, again, it's not closed. There's restrictions. So really at only during very specific times and really at no time was it entirely closed, because you see in that graph, even up to where there was still small amounts of ships going through, it was never truly closed. It was under constraints, restrictions, and conditions imposed by Iran, who, for very clearly, do have the ability to control the Strait of Hormuz. So we saw that during the initial days of this conflict, that vessels were still going through the Strait of Hormuz, in and out. restricted to any vessel that was flagged or supportive or part of Israel or the United States or its allies could not use it. The border, the Strait of Hormuz wasn't closed, it was restricted. And then as throughout that, we saw as restrictions were eased to like, okay, this ship can go, that ship can go, more ships can go. And then in reality, what we saw when more ships were actually coming out, the restriction was then that of the United States, which is identified and addressed in paragraph 4 of the MOU for the removal of the US blockade. So part of that restriction wasn't just the restriction that Iran had in terms of actual passage through the actual Strait of Hormuz itself. It was also restricted by what the United States would allow past here, coming out, or coming in. The distant blockade right here in the Gulf of Oman, that was by the United States. And we had many incidents to where the United States even disabled ships with A-10 Warthog attack aircraft or Apaches with Hellfires, disabled ships that attempted to pass through that distant blockade. So we have to look at in terms of closed, controlled, or restricted. So it never was really closed. There were restrictions. During times of restriction, a part of that restriction, quite frankly, the more impediment restriction was the United States distant blockade because nothing could get in, and anything that did make its way out was turned around or stopped. So to look at the flow, it was never really closed. Now to look at Iran has the ability to impart control because, and this goes back to where everyone needs to understand, especially, Americans that are watching this in terms of the US military involvement or US policy as we're seeing it, the Strait of Hormuz always, before this conflict, always had control measures for traffic in the Strait of Hormuz. The entire Strait of Hormuz was not an open 8-lane highway where everybody willy-nilly can just go however they want. The navigable strait of this almost 20-kilometer strait, there is a 12 nautical mile navigable channel. That means it's dredged, it's maintained, it's kept for passage. You don't want a giant ship to get stuck in shallow water. So this navigable channel is on the Iranian side, so to speak, of the Strait of Hormuz. That navigable channel goes right through here, right along here through by Qasem Island, right through there. That is the coming in and going out. There's 2 lanes, which is through that area. So for Iran to say, Iran, in coordination with the Sultanate of Oman, will dictate the administrative controls and procedures for usage of these 2 lanes, and we will implement going forward fees associated to maintaining this trafficable channel. Okay, that doesn't mean it's closed. Now, when we had this ship from Singapore attempt to go through, that ship from Singapore attempted to go through, not in the authorized, predetermined, before this war even started, agreed upon, always use navigable channel, but right along here through the Oman side, right through the islands there, the Isthmus island chain, skirting the coastline and coming down here. That isn't, nor has it ever been, okay to use. Never. So when you consider that the use of that and who supported that, the United States Navy provided aircraft to cover for those ships. So when you think about who's trying to break the MOU, it's the United States. Now, Iran's control, Iran says very clear, make arrangements using its best efforts for safe passage. Did we see vessels start going through the Strait of Hormuz in that period where we said, okay, it's open? We did. We absolutely did. Donald Trump then comes out, I think, what was it, last Thursday, Friday? The Strait of Hormuz is open for business. Everything's great. And even according to the graph you showed, if the norm was close to 150, and even with Donald Trump's proclamation of we're open for business is still only near 50, that's obviously not the case. But when you look at paragraph 4 and 5 specifically, has the United States removed U.S. naval forces from the Gulf of Oman? No. It's supposed to do that. We haven't done that yet. Has Iran completely lifted restrictions or control measures for what goes in and out of the Strait of Hormuz? No. But the reality is, going forward now and forever, is that 12 nautical mile, 2-lane incoming outgoing passage through the Strait of Hormuz will now forever be maintained with administrative control, just like the guy or gal that checks your passport at the Canadian border of what goes through the Strait of Hormuz. That is the new condition. That is the new reality. And the United States is trying to renege on that. The United States is trying to change that condition in the MOU because there's a lot of backlash. You know, Donald Trump signed this thing, and immediately the backlash to his base, the backlash from the Zionist supporters, the backlash from Israel realized that, okay, we have to change something here. So the United States is attempting to renegotiate, or to basically, they've betrayed this deal. But to put that blame on Iran and say, well, Iran has closed the strait, etc., that is not only a disingenuous argument by those that make that argument, it's factually incorrect. The Strait of Hormuz is not closed. It is controlled. There's a difference. And I would say that a lot of that, if you look at that period where that graph drops all the way to the bottom and you see almost that flat line, a lot of that control for anything getting in to get oil to then come out wasn't done by Iran. It was the United States Navy. So coming into these negotiations and talking about control, closure, who's doing what, there needs to be a level of sincerity and honesty and transparency if we're ever actually going to get towards an agreement. Now, with the Strait of Hormuz, should Iran and Oman, and very arguably the UAE, have a tri-nation administrative control mechanism for administrative control of the strait? Absolutely. They absolutely should. There's no reason that they wouldn't. The Strait of Gibraltar has an administrative control measure. The Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, the Panama Canal, the Bab el-Mandab, they all have tri-nation, multi-nation, or singular nation, like in the Panama Canal, administrative measures. So why shouldn't that exist? But to say that Iran imposing a control measure of administrative control to maintain commercial traffic efficiently is saying that it's closed, that's simply not true. And the United States is using that narrative as pretense to now strike Iran, to say Iran has betrayed or has gone back on the deal, when that's not true. That is factually incorrect to say that.